Today's talk is about weak vowels. And the basic claim is that in English we have really two sets of vowels. The strong vowels, which you're already familiar with, and a separate set of weak vowels that are used in unstressed syllables, in certain unstressed syllables. Now we've already come across this, I'm sure you have, in the notation involving the symbol, the ordinary letter I, that we use in transcribing words like happy, coffee, valley, where it's at the end, glorious, where it's before another vowel, and in the weak form of a word such as me, which we see in tell me. Now, the point here is twofold. First of all, there's the linguistic, the phonemic point, that in stressed syllables, strong syllables, we do need to make the difference between E and I, because green and grin mean different things. Sleep and slip. Don't sleep on the floor is different from don't slip on the floor. Feeling and filling are different. So that's in those stressed syllables. But in these unstressed syllables, this distinction does not apply. There's no possibility of distinguishing a word happy from a word happy. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. Which brings us to the other point, namely that there is considerable variation in the usage of native speakers. Some people say happy with a definitely id-like quality, like grin. Other people say happy with an e-like quality, such as green. Many people use something that is intermediate between them, or fluctuate inconsistently. Now, I know for many of you it's difficult in the first place to distinguish the vowels of green and grin, sheep and ship. So really for you this is good news, because it means that in these weak syllables it doesn't matter. You don't need to listen for the difference. You don't need to worry about it when you pronounce it, as long as it's in approximately the right area. Linguistically, we speak of the neutralization of this distinction. This is a technical term, which is actually a translation of the German word Aufhebung, introduced by schwa in the 1930s, who first analyzed this kind of phenomenon. Well, we similarly have a weak U vowel, which we see in words such as value, thank you. In thank you very clearly, because we say you for the strong form of you, but we don't say thank you with the same strong U, we say thank you. Thank you, and that's the corresponding U. Situation, influence before a vowel. Weak form of to before a vowel, to us. In Daniel Jones you find these equated with the vowels grin and slip, and indeed in Gimson as well. Which is fair enough if we have one system that applies in all syllables. But A, this excludes the millions of people who use a rather tenser vowel in that position, and B, it doesn't reflect this phonological fact of neutralization. There is a problem when we have inflectional endings added to the end of words ending like this. So if baby has this coffee vowel, happy vowel, what do we have in babies? Now there are people who say something like baby with a tense E, but babies with a laxer quality. There are others who don't make any difference, either having in both, babies, baby, babies, or E in both, baby, babies. Same with the past tense of carry, carried, and in words like prettier and value. Well, the way to test this out is to ask people about cabs, taxis, and the plural of tax. We have to pay our taxes. Do they sound the same, or do they sound different? They all got into taxes. You've got to pay your taxes. Well, for me, they sound the same. But I'm necessarily typical. There are many, many other speakers of English who have a subtle difference between them. Taxis, taxes, that sort of thing. And that justifies using the different notation, that is, keeping the notation of the happy vowel in words like taxi, even in plural. Well, anyhow, all of this then reflects the general point that we have a system of weak vowels which is different from the strong vowels. And these weak vowels essentially arise from the process of weakening. English, like Russian, has a system of weakening its vowels in unstressed syllables. Unlike Russian, though, this is inconsistent. In Russian, you weaken vowels according to very clear rules in unstressed syllables. In English, in some unstressed syllables we weaken, but in others we don't. And that's the difficulty in English. Well, we can see this in related words like preside, president. As you know, what a president does is to preside. And if we compare the first vowel in president, where it's stressed, you can see it's pre. But when it's unstressed, it's weakened. Preside. Some people weaken it to schwa, say preside. The point is it weakens. Nobody says preside, but we all say president. The second vowel in preside is in strong I form, but in president it's weakened to E. You might also compare presidential, the adjective, where the stress is thrown onto the final syllable, therefore the vowel has to strengthen and we get E rather than presidential. So we really do have to recognize processes of weakening in English. Here are more examples. Vary, air in the first syllable, but variety, v in the first syllable. Vary, there's our weak happy vowel in the second syllable. Also variation, where it's followed by a vowel. But in variety, where the stress is thrown on it by the -ty suffix, you get I, variety. Now, the precise nature of the weak vowels varies a bit. I mean, weak vowels don't matter all that much, and you get difference among different speakers. So, if we take this word down at the bottom, which I call visibility, there's my the transcription of my pronunciation in large at the bottom, visibility. Visibility. Daniel Jones, 100 years ago, pronounced it as, if I can imitate, visibility. Visibility. With I in each syllable, visibility. Well, it would sound very funny and old-fashioned nowadays to say visibility. The philosopher Bertrand Russell spoke of infinite possibilities. Infinite possibilities. Which again now sounds very old-fashioned. Nowadays you say infinite possibilities. So there is a kind of drift in weak vowels from I, which is now a bit old-fashioned in some positions, towards And there are some people who would use more than I do, indeed in plurals like horses rather than horses. But the point remains that we weaken. Now we weaken not only in these lexically related words, derived words from the same stem, but also, as you well know, in weak forms. Words with weak forms have a strong form with a strong vowel and a weak form with a weak vowel. And the essence of a weak form is that it has a weak vowel. So strong form for, weak form for. What did you ask for? Strong form, splendid position. I asked for more. For, weak form. Can, strong form, strong vowel am. Can, weak form, weak vowel I can run faster than you can. I can, weak form, I can run faster than you can. Them, strong form, them, weak form. It was them, strong form because it's stressed. I saw them do it, weak form them. So here too we've got this alternation between strong and weak, this process of weakening. Well, what are these weak vowels? The vowels that result from weakening. That's how we define define them. We've got three obvious ones to start with. The happy vowel, somewhere up here, front close-ish. The thank you vowel, somewhere up here, back close-ish. And the schwa in the middle. Now you see, instead of putting pinpoints on my vowel chart there, I've given you great vague ellipse shapes, because I think it's unrealistic to attempt to locate weak vowels too precisely. It doesn't matter where exactly they are. And whether you say happy or happy doesn't matter. Whether you say disability or disability doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Somewhere in that area. Well, I'm afraid it does mean the English vowel system is rather complex. Here are some examples of related words where we can see long vowels, short vowels, and weak vowels for the same morpheme, the same bit of the word. So we have to compete. Stressed on the peat is therefore strong vowel E, long vowel. In the adjective form competitive, we switch to the short strong vowel. Compete, competitive, related words. But in competition, because of the effect of the ischen suffix, the same syllable is now weak, and so we pronounce it either with I or with a weak vowel, either competition or competition, doesn't matter. And this is really the essence of why English spelling is so very confusing, because it does not tell you in these related words whether we're dealing with a strong long vowel, a strong short vowel, or a weak vowel. And yet to sound even halfway natural in English, you've got to get on top of this and learn which vowel is which. Same sort of thing in conspire, long, strong I, conspiracy, short, strong I, and, well, there isn't any word conspiration, but we do have inspiration, where it's weakened, again to the order. Tone, tonic, intonation. O, long, or short, weak. Historian, or long, historical, or short. History, either schwa, history, or in fact that can be lost entirely. We can say history with just two syllables, 0. Compare, comparison, comparable. Some people say comparable or comparable, but if you say it with a stress on the com, then you get weakening, comparable. Now, the question is, what vowel do we weaken to? Observe this line around the outside here. What this tells us is that I and E generally weaken to I, or sometimes schwa, whereas all the other ones weaken to schwa, of the short vowels. So, repetition tells us this is an E. It weakens to repeat or repeat. Less weakens to this or this in careless, careless. Angel, that's an but when it's strong, angelic, it has E. Them and them. Careful, well, full, but we weaken to schwa, careful. From, us weakens to us, at, anatomic, anatomic, and so on. So, these vowels weaken to schwa, and these to E. That seems fairly common sense. Long vowels behave in a similar way, really. The group that end my system B that I gave you early on go to E, the happy vowel, or sometimes to schwa, depending on position. The U, O, our go to U, thank you, sometimes to schwa, and the others all go to schwa. We've got those E, U, and but at least in my kind of English, we have to recognize probably two further weak vowels. We can see that I itself actually behaves as a weak vowel because we have it in words like finishing. Now there it's strong in the stressed syllable, fin, but in the other two it's where we would expect a weak vowel, finishing. And indeed, we've seen it in democracy compared with democrat and so on, weakening to I. Now, I say this is something sort of specific to received pronunciation because there are varieties of English that always treat these as schwa. Australian English is a very good example of this. In Australian English, you'd say finishing. Finish. It might be I in shing because it's between those rather palatable consonants, but anyhow, there's no opposition. And in Australian English, you don't really need to recognize any weak distinction between I and Now you do in my kind of English because in a word like valid, I have a different vowel from what I have in salad. Salad ends in lud, valid ends in lid. Australians typically say valid, salad with the same quality, it doesn't matter, and many Americans do this too. So even though I might make a difference, what we have learnt from Dr. Jenkins, amongst others, is that, well, there are a lot of native speakers who don't make a difference, let alone non-native speakers, so contrast of weak vowels doesn't really matter. Even odder in RP is the that you get in words like stimulus, rather than a schwa stimulus that other accents might use, executive, executive. Trouble is, in England, this is all associated with these matters of style and social class. Now, I say executive because that's the kind of person I am. If I were to say executive, either I'm being very colloquial or I'm pushing myself down market. You don't need to know about this. You don't need to take any notice of this at all, I think. But that's why I, for example, would say executive rather than using an in those positions. Anyhow, we do have to note the important point that although stressed syllables must contain a strong vowel, it doesn't follow that unstressed syllables must contain a weak vowel. Many unstressed syllables have strong vowels. Obviously in compounds, bedtime, I, there, strong vowel in the weak part of the compound. Acorn, words that are not compounds, we don't call it an acorn, we call it an acorn, that's the fruit of an oak tree, of course. Still less do we call it a corn, as some people might imagine. No, it's an acorn. Colleague, word mentioned by Dr. Jenkins, stressed on the col, but with a strong E, colleague. Chemical names like sulfate, keeps strong suffix ate. Gymnast, the noun torment, from the verb to torment, all of those have strong vowels in unstressed syllables. So we can't apply an absolutely general rule in the way you can in